Obviously, I'm not Hannah Fluck. Unfortunately, Hannah couldn't be with us today because she's not very well. So she has put together a paper on climate change and heritage policy. This is from a historic England point of view, but it will reference some of the wider devolved UK nations policy that was hinted at by Stephanie a moment ago, but it is very much England focused. But it talks about communications, it talks about language, and it talks about opportunities as well as problems when faced with climate change and setting heritage policy. I will use Hannah's notes. Because of the time, I will summarise some of what she has said. But for my Storm partners, we have Hannah's presentation, which is available for me to email around to you so we can see some of Hannah's detailed comments. She suggests that this presentation will look briefly at the policy context for climate change, some of the challenges for the heritage sector in engaging with that, and how we are working to ensure heritage is included. I think we in that context with Historic England and their partners. It's not all negative, Hannah wants to stress. Our historic environment also has a positive role to play in preparing us to adapt to these changes, providing sustainable technologies and techniques, communicating and contextualising change, and providing a focus for positive action in the light of what is some inevitable loss. Okay, so firstly, just a bit of scene setting. So Hannah is speaking here on behalf of the experiences of a public body looking after England's heritage. But it's important, she says, to emphasise that fact that we've already noted that England is just one of the 4 home nations in the UK. And of course, climate change are devolved matters within the UK. That is, the governments of Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland all make their own decisions, and they all have their own legislation concerning these areas. Therefore, although there are some similarities between the 4 nations, and Hannah and her colleagues do try to work together and share experiences, there are differences, but expertise and research is combined through the UK Historic Environment Adaptation Working Group, and that helps coordinate and pass on policies amongst the separate countries, and how those individual policies in the 4 home countries address climate change and heritage, and the nuances, the slightly different ways in which each of the 4 home countries, that's Northern Ireland, Scotland, Wales and England, address that. These are the partners in the UK Historic Environment Adaptation Working Group, which Hannah chairs on behalf of Historic England. It was born from the need to get heritage organisations together, particularly those who are working on climate change adaptation, to share ideas, offer moral support, and it's become gradually an important network for making the case for heritage and climate change. DEFRA, that's the Department for Rural Affairs, see it as a point of contact for the sector, and its existing policy has enabled Historic England and its partners to feed in more effectively to national climate change policy. The membership is not fixed. It has recently welcomed colleagues in Northern Ireland, for instance, and it's also making connections with the Republic of Ireland as they start, as Hannah says here, on their adaptation journey. Historic England and their partners have also been involved with the newly established Climate Heritage Network, which is seeking to promote the relevance of heritage climate conversations and policy internationally and raise awareness of climate change amongst heritage organisations. Right, so let's focus a bit on the context within England, although as ever, if we're focusing on England, that inevitably means looking at linkages elsewhere. So undoubtedly, she says, the complex details of English climate change policy is probably only of a passing interest to you, but she did want to provide some understanding of the policy context. The Climate Change Act, which you can see on this slide, from 2008, so that's now 10 years old, underpins the approach to climate change in England, covers a wide variety of issues from emissions to adaptation. Hannah wants primarily to talk about the input into the cycle of documents illustrated on this slide. It's a sort of 5-year cycle. So the adaptation reporting power is in orange, climate change risk assessment is in yellow, National Adaptation Programme is in green, and you'll see the progressive dates on those. As statutory advisors to the government on historic environment, Historic England have the opportunity to feed into and respond to each of these, which indeed Historic England have done. The Climate Change Risk Assessment, which was published in 2017, which you can see on the bottom right-hand corner, and it's worth pointing out here that, as Philip has suggested, this is new material since the Storm project started early in 2016. So that Climate Change Risk Assessment sets out the risks to climate presented to the UK as a whole, and it identifies the top risks. The very top risk identified in the UK is flooding and coastal erosion, and also suggests whether these require more different action, monitoring or further research. Climate risk to heritage is identified as a research priority in this particular 2017 document. There's a National Adaptation Programme published in 2018 that reports on how prepared England is for adapting to those climate change risks as identified in the Climate Change Risk Assessment document for 2017, and it draws on information submitted to the government through the Adaptation Reporting Power reports. And Historic England submitted a report to DEFRA in 2016 and have just committed to submitting an updated report as part of the third round of reporting for 2021. So let's have a look at some challenges and amongst politics and structure. Hannah acknowledges that this structure is complicated, but it's important as understanding the cycle of the framework really feeds into policy. It means that Historic England can prepare and be proactive rather than simply responding to consultation. It's not just the cycle, but the relationship between the key players that is important. The legislative framework and the impact of government structure on that affects how we all engage with this process and ensure heritage is a matter of consideration. DCMS, that's the Department for Culture, Media and Sport, are Historic England's sponsoring government department, but the majority of climate change risk and adaptation work is actually undertaken and led by DEFRA and the DEFRA family of organisations, supported by the independent body known as the Committee on Climate Change. The structures not only create physical and policy separation between these organisations, but they also affect the structure and language of policy and reports. And that theme of challenges, connections and communications is something that Hannah then goes on to look at in a bit more detail. She's got here the chapter headings from the Climate Risk Assessment document from 2017, and they also relate closely to the sections in the National Adaptation Programme report and shape the way in which information on climate change, risk and adaptation is gathered. Now, originally the historic environment was included here in the people and built environment section. So depending on what you think, in England our landscape and so-called natural environment is entirely the result of human activity over millennia. You could, and Hannah does argue, that there is in fact no natural landscape in the UK, certainly in England. Moreover, the majority of our archaeological sites are within rural areas and affected by processes and practices explored in the natural environment chapter. So Hannah argues for the relevance of heritage here. She's nearly argued, she says, that we were relevant to all the chapters, but one important lesson she learnt was learning to pick one's battles. However, when Historic England tried to engage with the natural environment chapter in the risk assessment document, the structure was not familiar. The language use made it hard to incorporate the historic environment. Plus, the chapter authors were not convinced that heritage had anything relevant to offer, which I think is rather an intriguing observation. Historic England's solution to this challenge of communication has been to try to learn the language of our partners in the natural environment. So Historic England looked at what was behind this particular approach taken by the natural environment sector. They found that this was reflecting the natural environment policy, which is currently heavily influenced by natural capital and ecosystem services approaches. And when they looked more closely, they found that the historic environment was generally not included in these approaches. Now, the complex history of the relationship between culture and nature that has led over millennia to the environment we value today was quite clearly missing from these discussions. So Historic England decided if you can't beat it, join them. And so they have developed a programme of research to change and challenge the absence of the historic environment from natural capital and ecosystem services by demonstrating that not only is the historic environment relevant, but it can also be helpful to include it. And Historic England thought that this research should make it easier to engage with those looking after our environment as a whole. Which brings us to heritage protection in England, the sort of legal framework which we have touched briefly on, so I can sort of just give you the headlines for this. So in England, this is very similar to Ireland, so Northern Ireland, Wales and Scotland. In England, there are 3 mechanisms for heritage protection. The first is through designations such as listing for buildings and scheduling for archaeological sites. The second is through the planning system, where this is where the majority of heritage protection occurs. The driving principle is the polluter pays, so the developer who might damage the resource therefore has to pay for mitigating against that damage. And Historic England plays a small role in that process, whereas they take the lead in the designation of listed buildings and scheduling. But Hannah goes on to say that there's a third area of designation that's quite often not given much thought, certainly to the wider wider world outside public sector archaeology. This is the concept of stewardship schemes that seek to pay landowners, in particular farmers, in return for delivering some benefit. Historic England have been very successful in securing a place for the historic environment within those benefits, although the delivery of advice for specific applications is delivered at a local level by local authority archaeologists. This last one has delivered enormous benefits, particularly for archaeology sites under the plough. However, it is also the most vulnerable as it's linked to the European Common Agricultural Policy, and subsidies face an uncertain future post-Brexit. So traditionally, underpinning all approaches to heritage protection in the UK are 2 principles. Firstly, that the archaeological resource is finite and non-renewable. Secondly, that preservation in situ is preferred. That is, given the finite and non-renewable nature of the resource, the ideal situation for archaeological sites is to be preserved in situ. And she says, hold those thoughts because these principles actually pose some challenges which Historic England are having to consider due to climate change. And I think she's quite right there, as she'll go on to explain. We've already seen that in several presentations today. So in 2012, then English Heritage, now Historic England, commissioned a report by consultants Atkins to report on the key environmental threats to the historic environment. That report identified 6 key threats or themes, which are now, I'm sure, familiar to you: coastal processes, flooding, extremes of wetting and drying, wildfire, pests and diseases, and urban heat island effect, which we've heard about throughout today. Now, in themselves, none of these threats are new, says Hannah. However, climate change is changing their frequency, intensity, and locations. And in addition, the way in which people are responding to perceived threats has also had an impact and may itself act as a risk multiplier. So let's have a look at some of the impacts that Hannah would like us to think about. Again, we've touched on most of these today and this afternoon, so I can just give you the headlines. And indeed, she says she doesn't want to dwell on this because she has some other issues she wants to talk about in detail. But you can see here we've got floodwater inundation and saturation can damage historic buildings and designed landscapes. Assets on the coastal fringe can become increasingly at risk of inundation, as we've seen, damage or loss of erosion. Dunes and peats and other intertidal deposits are likely to come under greater threat through wave energy and as storm storm intensity increases. We've got accelerated erosion leading to opportunities to improve archaeological understanding through the exposure of new deposits on the coast. We've also got sudden heavy rainfall, as well as the cumulative impact of less intense but repeated events. All of these can have a damaging effect on the guttering of buildings and the drainage of designed landscapes. They exacerbate erosion. And the greater extremes of fluctuations of temperatures, we've already mentioned, hotter and drier conditions, the biological infestations, opportunistic exotic species coming in. So overall, for some assets, she says, in some places, mitigating the impact of climate change in the medium to long term might not be practical or not even possible. In such cases, there will need to be a clear rationale for accepting loss. The historic environment will be affected by actions undertaken by other sectors to adapt as well, mitigate for or counter predicted environmental change. So heritage here, I think Hannah is saying, is not isolated. It is linked to everything else. And it is not possible to retain everything. Not wanting to put words into Hannah's or English or Historic England's mouth. So putting all these elements together presents some real challenges for the historic environment and climate change in England as well as the rest of the UK. We have a heritage protection approach that is built upon the idea of preservation in situ, of minimal intervention, of conserving the resource for future generations. But we're facing changes that are accelerating the processes by which we lose heritage or lose information, dewatering, coastal change, erosion, ground instability. Our heritage protection systems are designed to respond to active threats, says Hannah. From the development from human activity upon sites, they are poorly equipped, however, to respond to natural and attritional loss. Yet there's an expectation that an organisation such as Historic England is there to protect heritage. And dealing with the loss we can see, such as a threat from erosion at Whitby, in the lower photos here, is one thing. But addressing that which is not visible, such as the loss of organic material and the impact of the shrinkage of peat and the consequences of dewatering, as you can see at Star Car at the top there, is quite another. There's a real need to rethink our relationship with the conservation of our heritage, argues Hannah. There's an interesting point here that is often a source of misunderstanding and a cause of false expectation that Historic England are primarily concerned with the protection of heritage, not just Historic England but all heritage bodies. That conservation is not necessarily the same as preservation. This is illustrated in a legal case brought by local residents in Sussex against Natural England in 2009, the case of Boggis versus Natural England, in a ruling which concerned the redefinition of a boundary of a triple SI, Site of Scientific Special Interest, used for designating areas of importance for ecology or geology. The judge accepted that Natural England's point that in this instance, allowing the erosion of the cliff face was part of the conservation of the special interest of the site. Loss was explicitly accepted as part of conservation. Although this case was concerned with geological conservation, there is perhaps something we can take of relevance to heritage conservation from this particular case study. Natural processes at work that cause the degradation of archaeological information before we are even aware of it. Nor can we record everything. Time, money, people are finite resources, and there will always be technological advances that will gather information we previously didn't think of. And of course, as every undergraduate knows, the process of archaeological investigation is in itself destructive. So when faced with inevitable loss, what should our reaction be? Hannah would like to pose this partly as a point for discussion, perhaps in a bit, but also to highlight some present opportunities. And I'd just like to run through those opportunities quickly. Number of opportunities for heritage within the climate change debate, and all of these are relevant at a policy level as well as in a more practical sense. The most obvious archaeological benefit, and perhaps the other side of the coin to the issue of loss, is discovery. Increased rates of coastal erosion, more frequent drought are all beneficial for archaeological discovery as archaeological deposits and sites are exposed or revealed through crop marks. Of course, discovery itself has its own challenges, particularly for an organisation like Historic England, where there is a perception that they are fonder of last resource. But in a world of diminishing public resources, this simply is not always possible to fund this kind of work. She has one case study here, which, as you can see, is the result of a fire on the moors at Fylingdales in Yorkshire in September 2003. The fire devastated vegetation and fragile peat soils over several square kilometres of heathland, revealing previously unknown archaeological landscapes, everything from prehistoric field systems and rock art through to 20th century military training and industrial features. Photos taken by the English Heritage Aerial Reconnaissance Team as part of the collaborative project involving the North Yorks National Park Authority, English Heritage and DEFRA, the local landowners, the Strickland Estate and the local court neat, helped to identify many of these new features and left a legacy that is influencing management of that area today. However, the speed at which the teams had to work in order to record exposed sites before vegetation took over, as well as the increased erosion risks that threatened many of these previously unknown archaeological sites and the sheer scale of the problem were really challenging. And yet the risk of wildfires like that at Fylingdales is set to increase. And I would say, as an aside, we've seen that this summer with the fires around Greater Manchester in the Northern Peak District and on Withington. Using aerial photography and other reconnaissance techniques is a way in which to speed up that recording, but it's not the complete answer. In policy terms, there is a need to be wary of expectations, to prepare for and begin the public conversation about how we can't save everything. And we need also to seek partnerships as an opportunity to encourage others to undertake recording and monitoring. So that leads on to opportunities for engagement with a wider audience. She's got two examples here. One is Citizen, which we've just heard about. Hooray. The other is Historic England itself have sponsored a PhD student at the University of Exeter, Tanya Venture, who's just started to look at coastal heritage, loss and communities as part of a AHRC Collaborative Doctoral Programme Award. And she's looking at some of the issues surrounding our approach to those archaeological sites which will be lost to coastal processes and how we might best work with different communities associated with those sites and locations to manage loss. I think you can see some of the thoughts that Hannah and her colleagues in English Heritage are having to deal with here. So taking the long view in terms of opportunities, fundamentally archaeologists tell stories about peoples and places. We recognise that there is no purely natural landscape in England, but that our landscape, our places have been shaped by the millennia of people living in them. This long view is important for a number of reasons and is something that Hannah is currently trying to promote, particularly in the areas of flooding and coastal change. So using reconstruction imagery can help to communicate how past landscapes have changed and understand why they may be at risk from current flooding. And Hannah has this photograph here in the lower part of Athelney, the island of Athelney and Eastling in Somerset. Flooding devastated communities here a few years ago, but the whole landscape became flooded. When landscapes like this become flooded, sometimes the past leaps out. So what you're actually looking at there is the high ground that is the Isle of Athelney, the stronghold of Alfred the Great in the 9th century AD. And also you can see the East Ling, which is a late Saxon burh, which more or less follows the area left free from the floodwater on the left of the photo. The two areas are connected by a strip, a medieval causeway that acts as a flood defence today. Looking at this picture, it's easy to see, she says, why the Saxon might have chosen this as an area for settlement. And she links this to some popular culture. The BBC TV adaptation of Bernard Cornwell's The Lost Kingdom has King Alfred fighting the Vikings, but having first hiding out in the Isle of Athelney. And she suggests that photos like this, combined with historical understanding, can be quite powerful in explaining why those areas are at risk today, and also may reach those who otherwise wouldn't engage in these kind of issues. Moving on to learning from the past, which is sort of almost her concluding slide. what can the historic environment offer in terms of understanding landscape history and informing sustainable landscape scale flood and water management? My building conservation research colleagues, so that's Historic England colleagues, have been looking closely at what traditional building techniques can offer. The most recent climate change risk assessment identified the risk of overheating in urban islands in particular, but also noted that many traditional constructed buildings, particularly timber frame buildings, cope far better with hot temperatures than their modern counterparts. Ironically, she says, while we've been focusing on energy efficiency and insulation, and therefore insulating these older properties, we might have been undermining a future benefit as temperatures increase, as they no longer have the capacity to cool in hot weather with these extra insulated modern adaptations. She calls this maladaptation, where improvements for adaptation in one risk inadvertently negatively affect the ability to cope with another. And that's a real challenge in climate change adaptation, balancing those competing needs. And when it comes to flooding, we now have a lot of evidence that traditional materials such as lime mortars and plasters, wood and stone, are often far better at recovering from flooding than modern materials. Historic England are looking at ways of increasing awareness of this and improving the skills of those dealing with flood-affected areas. And she points out they have a heritage action zone in Appleby in the Eden Valley in Cumbria, which was recently flooded successively in the last decade. And there they have an exciting project with a semi-detached house badly affected by flooding. That's being refurbished using traditional materials, and it has various sensors embedded in the fabric to monitor things like energy efficiency and to look at how it recovers if it were to flood again. They're also working closely with the Cumbrian Action Group for Sustainability to promote the importance of traditional materials in sustainable building and flood-resilient homes. She has one final point. She'd like to raise the profile of an organisation called Climate Outreach. They're doing some fantastic work on how we communicate the issue of climate and climate change. She would urge everyone to look at the Uncertainty Handbook. It's only 14 pages long. It's an engaging read, but it makes some very powerful points about how to communicate effectively. And she thinks that there are a lot of lessons for all of us about how to contribute positively to conversations about climate change within the heritage sector and beyond in looking at this particular document. On behalf of Hannah, thank you.